In the suffocating heat of the summer of 1852, the 13 wealthiest sugarcane plantation owners in Louisiana gathered at the Blackwood Manor for what they thought was a routine business meeting. None of them would walk out alive. 3 days later, authorities discovered their charred bodies arranged in the shape of a cross around a massive sugarcane furnace. Their hands were bound with oil-soaked twine, their mouths stuffed with raw sugarcane leaves. The only witness was a female slave named Zara Nkosi, found sitting calmly in the manor's drawing room, humming an African folk song while meticulously polishing silver spoons. When questioned, she spoke only one sentence in broken English: "Justice burns slower than sugarcane, but it burns clean." The colonial records of this event were sealed by order of Governor Paul O'Hebert and buried in the New Orleans archives for over a century. Tonight, we uncover the horrifying truth behind what came to be known as the Blackwood Massacre, a story of revenge so methodical and brutal that it changed the way the entire state viewed its human property. Before we continue with the story of Zara Nkosi and the night that shook colonial Louisiana to its core, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because stories like this, buried by time and covered up by the powerful, deserve to be told. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments what state you're listening from. Are there any dark historical secrets lurking in your backyard? Now, let's go back to 1852 and discover how a woman, considered nothing more than property, orchestrated one of the most calculated acts of vengeance in American colonial history. The story begins not on that horrific night, but 18 years earlier in the bustling port of New Orleans, Louisiana. In 1834, the state was experiencing unprecedented prosperity thanks to the labor of African slaves on the vast sugarcane fields along the Mississippi River. One of the most successful planters was Theodore Blackwood, a second-generation immigrant who had turned 5,000 acres of swampland into a sugarcane empire. Blackwood was a man of particular cruelty, even by the harsh standards of the era. Over 6 feet tall, with pale blue eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He had built a reputation for breaking slaves both physically and spiritually. Blackwood Manor was whispered about in slave quarters across the region. It was said that slaves sent there either died within a year or became empty shells of their former selves. In November 1834, a French slave ship named La Victoire docked in New Orleans harbor, carrying 200 souls from the Guinea coast. Among them was a young woman, perhaps 22 years old, given the name Zara Nkosi by her new masters. What made her different was not immediately apparent to the white colonists who inspected her like cattle at the market. She was of average height and build with intelligent dark eyes and intricate tribal scars on her back that told the story of her chieftain lineage, a story that would remain forever unknown to her captors. What they didn't know was that Zara had been the daughter of a powerful village chief, trained from childhood in the arts of strategy, negotiation, and what the colonial mind would dismiss as witchcraft, but was in fact a sophisticated understanding of herbs, poisons, and human psychology. She had witnessed French pirates burn her village, kill her father, and enslave her people. In her mind, every white face was associated with that primal crime. Theodore Blackwood purchased her for $480 sterling, a significant sum that reflected her health and youth. He had specific plans for his new acquisition. Blackwood's previous house slave, an older woman named Eliza, had died under mysterious circumstances, though everyone on the plantation knew she had been beaten to death for breaking a porcelain vase imported from France. From her first day at Blackwood Manor, Zara began what would become an 18-year campaign of careful observation and meticulous planning. She learned English quickly but feigned understanding far less than she actually did. She watched, she listened, she memorized every insult, every act of cruelty, every name mentioned in the discreet conversations among the plantation elite. Blackwood Manor was more than a home. It was the unofficial meeting place for the so-called Sugar Cane Council, a group of 13 planters who controlled the state's agricultural policy and thus its political future. These men met monthly to discuss sugar prices, slave regulations, and how to maximize profits while minimizing colonial oversight from Washington. They considered themselves kings of their own domains, accountable to no earthly power. The 13 members of this council represented the most powerful families in the state. Theodore Blackwood, the unofficial leader, Lawrence Duval, whose plantation produced more sugar than any other in the Americas, Francois Leclerc, who doubled as a colonial judge, Etienne Moreau, who owned the largest slave trading operation between New Orleans and Mobile, Pierre Beaumont, whose political connections reached the governor's office, Jacques Thibault, a former French naval officer who ran his plantation like a military camp, Armand Rousseau, whose family was wealthy from the earliest colonial settlements, Victor Landry, who specialized in breaking newly arrived slaves, Henri Duval, known for his inventive torture techniques, Louis Fontaine, whose plantation bordered 3 others and served as an information hub, Marcel Girard, who kept detailed records of a slave breeding program, Claude Benoit, whose medical background made him particularly effective at keeping slaves alive just long enough to extract maximum labor, and finally, Raoul Street Claire, the youngest member at 38, whose enthusiasm for violence had earned him swift acceptance into this exclusive circle. These men were not merely cruel, they were systematically evil, viewing human beings as nothing more than agricultural equipment to be used, repaired, and discarded at the command of economics. They shared techniques for breaking rebellious spirits, compared notes on optimal calorie rations to maximize labor output while minimizing costs, and bragged about their most creative punishments during their monthly meetings. Zara served at these meetings for 18 years, moving silently around the dining room like a ghost, refilling glasses and clearing plates while the men discussed their human property as if they were cattle. She heard them laugh about families being torn apart, debate the merits of whipping versus branding, and plan expansions that would require the import of hundreds more slaves. But what truly set Zara's plan in motion was not just the general brutality of slavery. It was something specific and far more personal. In the spring of 1851, everything changed for Zara Nkosi. After 17 years of silent servitude, she had done what the planters considered impossible. She had preserved her humanity in the midst of hell. Moreover, she had found love. His name was Malik, though the plantation ledgers listed him simply as Boy Jack. He was born in 1829 on the Leclerc plantation, making him 22 when he caught Zara's attention. Malik possessed a rare combination of physical strength and intellectual curiosity that had survived the brutal breaking process that crushed most slaves within their first year. He could read, a skill learned in secret from a long-dead sympathetic overseer, and he had been secretly teaching the alphabet and basic numbers to other slaves during their brief Sunday respites. Malik and Zara began meeting in secret, initially sharing information about their master's movements and plans. Their relationship deepened gradually, with the careful patience of people who understood that being discovered meant death. They communicated through a system of songs and gestures that looked like typical slave behavior to a white observer, but carried detailed messages about escape routes, sympathetic contacts, and opportunities for resistance. By the end of 1851, they had developed what was perhaps the most sophisticated intelligence network in colonial Louisiana. Zara used her access to the Sugarcane Council meetings to gather information on patrol schedules, legal changes, and plantation vulnerabilities. Malik, in turn, used his work assignments he was often loaned out to other plantations for heavy labor to establish contacts across the region. They were planning something unprecedented, not a simple escape attempt that would affect only themselves, but a coordinated uprising that could free hundreds of slaves across multiple plantations. They had identified sympathetic whites, mapped out safe houses, and even established contact with a free black community in Cuba that could provide sanctuary for escaped slaves. But their careful plans were destroyed by simple human emotion. On the 20th of March, 1852, Theodore Blackwood announced at the monthly Sugarcane Council meeting that he had decided to expand his breeding program. He had identified several prime female specimens who would be paired with males from other plantations to produce what he called superior labor stock. The program would begin immediately, with the selected females moved to a separate compound where they would be under constant supervision to ensure successful impregnation. Zara's name was at the top of his list. As she overheard this conversation while serving wine to the council members, Zara's face remained impassive, But something fundamental shifted inside her. She had survived 18 years of slavery by holding on to hope. Hope for freedom, hope for revenge, hope for a future where she could live as a person instead of property. Now Blackwood was planning to reduce her to nothing more than a breeding animal. That night, she met Malik at their usual spot, a fallen oak tree deep in the plantation's sugarcane fields, where their voices would be masked by the chorus of insects and night birds. She told him of Blackwood's plan, and they both understood the implications. Once she was moved to the breeding compound, their contact would become impossible. Their intelligence network would collapse. The planned uprising would die before it began. Malik pleaded with her in desperation. They should run that very night. He had established contact with a Cuban merchant who could smuggle them to Havana in a week. They could be free, start a new life, perhaps even find a way to help other slaves from a position of relative safety. But Zara refused. "Running saves us," she told him in their native African tongue, a language they used only for their most private conversations. "But it changes nothing for our people. These men will continue their evil. More ships will come, more families will be destroyed, more children will grow up as property." She had spent 18 years watching these 13 men make decisions that affected thousands of lives with casual cruelty. She had heard them laugh about separation, discuss torture techniques like recipes, and plan expansions that would bring more suffering to people who looked like her. "I have learned their patterns," she continued. "I know their secrets. I know when they are most vulnerable. We have one chance to send a message that will be remembered forever, a chance to make them feel the fear they make us feel." Malik understood what she was proposing, and he was terrified. Not of death slaves lived with the constant threat of death, but of the systematic torture that would precede execution if they were caught. He had seen what happened to slaves who raised a hand against a white man. The punishments were designed to be an example, to break the spirit of every other slave who witnessed them, but he also understood that Zara was right. Their escape plan would save 2 lives while leaving the system intact. Her alternative was impossibly dangerous, but it held the possibility of something greater, a blow against slavery itself that might inspire others, or at least make masters think twice about their casual cruelty. They spent the next 2 weeks refining a plan that was part intelligence operation, part psychological warfare, and part tactical assault. Zara would use her access to the monthly Sugarcane Council meeting to create an opportunity for a devastating reprisal. Malik would handle the logistics, gathering materials, establishing alibis for sympathetic slaves, and creating contingency plans for various scenarios. What they developed was perhaps the most sophisticated act of slave resistance in American colonial history. And it all revolved around a simple truth Zara had observed over 18 years of servitude. The members of the Sugarcane Council were so confident in their absolute power that they had become careless about their personal security. The monthly meeting scheduled for the 28th of June, 1852, would be their last. The dawn of the 28th of June, 1852, broke with the suffocating heat that made Louisiana summers almost unbearable for anyone but those who had grown up in the equatorial climate of Africa. Zara woke before dawn, as she had every day for 18 years, and began her morning routine. But today was different. Today was the culmination of 18 years of careful observation, meticulous planning, and suppressed rage. The Sugarcane Council meeting was scheduled to begin at 4 p.m., giving the 13 planters time to travel to Blackwood Manor and conduct any preliminary business before the official session. These meetings typically lasted 5 to 7 hours, depending on the agenda and the amount of imported cognac Theodore Blackwood provided for his guests. Zara had spent the week studying the patterns of previous meetings, noting everything from seating arrangements to bathroom breaks to the timing of different agenda items. She knew that Etienne Moreau always arrived early to conduct private business with Blackwood. She knew that Armand Rousseau had a weak bladder and would excuse himself approximately every 120 minutes. She knew that discussions about sugar prices always happened before dinner was served, while conversations about slave management typically occurred afterward when the cognac had loosened their tongues. Most importantly, she knew about the sugarcane furnace. Blackwood Manor had been built in 1815 with an enormous kitchen designed to feed not only the main house but also the overseers, craftsmen, and house slaves who lived on the property. The centerpiece of this kitchen was a massive sugarcane furnace imported from France at great expense. Unlike the wood-burning ovens found in most colonial homes, this furnace could maintain extremely high temperatures for extended periods, making it ideal for large-scale cooking operations. The furnace stood nearly 9 feet tall and 5 feet square, built from imported fire bricks and surrounded by an iron frame for hanging pots, supporting spits and regulating airflow. When fully stoked with sugarcane and coal, it could reach temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt copper and gold. Blackwood took great pride in this furnace, often showing it off to guests as an example of his prosperity and sophistication. What Blackwood didn't know was that Zara had been secretly studying the furnace's operation for months, learning how to control its temperature, how to maintain maximum heat for extended periods, and how to manipulate the airflow to create specific conditions. She had also been gradually stockpiling sugarcane in the storage room adjacent to the kitchen, telling the overseer that Mr. Blackwood had ordered extra fuel for an expanded cooking operation. 5 days before the meeting, Zara received devastating news that solidified her resolve beyond any doubt. Malik had been sold. Francois Leclerc had decided his plantation needed extra hands for an expansion project, and he had convinced Blackwood to sell Boy Jack for $650. The transaction would be finalized immediately after the Sugarcane Council meeting, with Malik to be transferred to the Leclerc plantation the following morning. When Zara learned of this sale, she understood that her window of opportunity was closing permanently. In 5 days, she would lose the man she loved, be forced into a breeding program that would destroy her spirit, and be powerless to watch the Sugarcane Council continue its systematic brutalization of her people. The time for patience was over. That evening, she met Malik for what they both knew would be the last time. They spoke in hushed tones by the fallen oak tree, sharing 18 years of memories compressed into a few precious hours. Malik pleaded with her one last time to abandon her plan and run with him that night. There was still time to get to Cuba, still time to build a life together away from the horrors of plantation slavery. But Zara's mind was made up. These men believe they are gods, she told him. They believe they can do anything to us without consequence. Tomorrow I will show them they are wrong. I will show them we are human, not animals, and that humans fight back when pushed beyond endurance. Malik understood that argument was futile. He had known Zara for less than 2 years, but he had learned to recognize the steel in her voice when her mind was fully set. Instead, he spent the rest of their time together, helping her refine the final details of her plan. The next morning, June 27, Zara began her final preparations. She started with a thorough inventory of the kitchen and its adjacent storage areas, identifying every tool, ingredient, and material that could be useful. She paid particular attention to the oil-soaked twine and chains stored in the kitchen pantry, devices typically used to restrain slaves during punishment, but kept readily available throughout the plantation. She also made careful note of the kitchen layout and the movement patterns of the other house slaves throughout the day. The success of her plan would depend partly on ensuring that innocent slaves were not present when events unfolded, and partly on maintaining an appearance of normal operations until the crucial moment. Most importantly, she began preparing the sugarcane furnace. Starting at dawn, she began feeding sugarcane into the furnace at carefully calculated intervals, gradually raising the internal temperature while maintaining the appearance of a normal cooking preparation. By late afternoon, the furnace was approaching its peak operating temperature, ready to maintain maximum heat for several hours. The other house slaves noticed nothing unusual about Zara's behavior. She was always quiet and methodical in her work, and her preparations for the monthly Sugarcane Council meeting looked identical to her routine for previous gatherings. She polished the dining room, arranged the furniture, prepared the serving platters, and laid out the imported crystal glasses that Blackwood used to impress his guests. But hidden within the kitchen, arrangements were being made to turn a routine business meeting into something far more sinister. By midday on the 28th of June 1852, the first members of the Sugarcane Council had begun to arrive at Blackwood Manor. As always, Etienne Moreau was early, riding up the oak-lined avenue leading to the main house with the easy confidence of a man who owned more than 900 human beings and considered himself accountable to no earthly power. Zara watched from a kitchen window as Moreau dismounted, and handed his horse's reins to a stable slave. At 55, Moreau was one of the older members of the council, and his body showed the effects of decades of rich living, portly with thinning grey hair and the ruddy complexion of a man who consumed more imported cognac than was healthy, but his eyes were still sharp and calculating, the eyes of someone who had built a fortune by treating human beings as commodities to be bought, sold, and exploited with maximum efficiency. Moreau's plantation specialized in what was called seasoning, the brutal process of breaking newly arrived African slaves and teaching them to accept their condition as permanent and inescapable. Slaves who proved particularly resistant were often sold to Moreau, who had developed increasingly creative methods for destroying the will to resist. His techniques were so refined that other planters often sent their problem slaves to his operation, paying a premium for his services. Theodore Blackwood greeted Moreau at the front door with the elaborate courtesy that planters reserved for one another while treating their slaves like livestock. The two men retired to Blackwood's private study to discuss business too sensitive for the larger group, primarily new techniques for slave control and strategies for lobbying the colonial government to reduce restrictions on slave importation. Over the next hour, the remaining 11 members of the Sugarcane Council arrived in small groups, their carriages and horses creating a traffic jam around the circular drive in front of the main house. Zara recognized each of them as they arrived, having served enough of their meetings to know their faces, their voices, and their particular specializations in the management of human property. Lawrence Duval arrived with his usual retinue of armed overseers, a precaution he had adopted after a recent slave revolt attempt on his plantation was narrowly suppressed. Francois Leclerc arrived alone, but his horse carried the distinctive silver inlaid pistols that advertised his dual role as planter and colonial judge. Pierre Beaumont traveled in an elaborately decorated carriage, displaying his family crest, a show of ostentation that underscored his political connections and social ambitions. Each arrival was greeted with similar ceremony, polite exchanges about the weather and the growing season and the persistent problem with natives along the frontier. These men saw themselves as the founding fathers of a great civilization, pioneers who were turning a wilderness into productive farmland that would feed the growing cities of colonial America. What they refused to acknowledge was that their civilization was built on a foundation of systematic brutality, that their wealth came from the unpaid labor of thousands of human beings who were treated worse than livestock, and that their political influence existed primarily to maintain and expand this system of exploitation. At precisely 4 o'clock, Theodore Blackwood called the monthly meeting to order in the formal dining room. The 13 men took their familiar seats around a massive walnut table imported from England at a cost that would have fed a typical colonial family for several years. The table's polished surface reflected the light from dozens of candles arranged in silver candelabras, creating an atmosphere of wealth and refinement that reinforced their sense of superiority and entitlement. Zara began serving the meal with her usual efficiency, moving silently around the table as the men discussed the business of slavery with the casual cruelty that had characterized their previous 216 monthly meetings. She had heard variations of these conversations hundreds of times, but today she listened with particular attention to every word, every inflection, every casual reference to human suffering. The agenda began, as always, with a discussion of sugar prices in the New Orleans market and strategies for maximizing profit in the upcoming harvest season. Lawrence Duval reported that his plantation had achieved record production by implementing what he called incentive-based management, a system that provided minimal extra rations to slaves who exceeded their daily quotas while systematically punishing underperformers. The key, Duval explained as he carved his imported beef, is to make them understand that their comfort level is entirely dependent on their productivity. Give them just enough hope to keep them working, but never enough security to make them complacent. Francois Leclerc nodded in agreement. I've had excellent results with family separation as a motivational tool. Nothing makes a field hand work harder than knowing his wife and children are being held in a different location, and that reunion is dependent on consistent performance. The conversation continued in this vein for nearly an hour, with each member sharing techniques for extracting maximum labor from their human property while minimizing the cost of food, housing, and medical care. They discussed breeding programs with the clinical detachment that a cattle rancher would use when planning to improve his herd. They compared notes on punishment techniques with the enthusiasm of craftsmen sharing trade secrets. Zara refilled their cognac glasses and cleared their plates as the men celebrated their latest innovations in human degradation. She maintained her usual blank expression of subservience, but inside her mind was making final notes on each man's position, each man's habits, and each man's potential for resistance when the moment came. As the official agenda concluded and the conversation became more informal, the men began sharing stories that revealed the true depth of their depravity. Etienne Moreau described a new torture device he had imported from the West Indies, a cramped metal cage suspended in the full sun that could literally cook a rebellious slave to death over several days. Victor Landry bragged about his latest breeding experiment, which involved the forced pairing of selected slaves to produce what he hoped would be a new generation of larger, stronger field hands. But it was Raoul Street, Claire, the youngest member of the council, who provided the final catalyst for what was about to unfold. "Gentlemen," Street Claire announced as Zara poured his after-dinner cognac, "I have exciting news about a new business opportunity. The Cubans are paying a premium for seasoned slaves in their South American territories. I propose we pool our resources, purchase a larger vessel, and begin a systematic export of our older, less productive stock." The room erupted in enthusiastic discussion as the 13 men began calculating the potential profits from selling their human property to the Cuban colonies where working conditions were even more brutal than in Louisiana. They debated logistics, discussed which political connections could facilitate the necessary permits, and estimated how many slaves they could afford to export while maintaining a sufficient workforce for their plantations. As Zara listened to these men plan the destruction of still more lives, she felt something inside her break. For 18 years, she had maintained her sanity by telling herself that their cruelty had limits, that even these monstrous men would eventually recognize some boundary of humanity, but there were no limits, no boundaries. Their capacity for inflicting suffering was bound only by economic considerations and their own imaginations. It was time to show them what it felt like to be powerless. At precisely 10:15 p.m., according to the Swiss imported clock that stood in Blackwood's dining room, Zara Nkosi made her move. The 13 members of the Sugarcane Council had concluded their official business and settled into the relaxed, after-dinner conversation that usually ended their monthly meetings. The room was warm with body heat and candlelight, filled with the smell of imported tobacco and expensive cognac. Most of the men had loosened their formal attire and assumed the relaxed posture of people who believe they are completely secure in their dominance. They were discussing Victor Landry's proposal to establish an official breeding registry that would track bloodlines across all their plantations, creating what they envisioned as a master race of slaves, specially bred for intelligence, strength, and docility. The conversation had become technical, almost academic, as they debated principles of genetics with the same detached interest they brought to discussions of crop rotation or soil improvement. No one noticed when Zara excused herself from the dining room, ostensibly to fetch more cognac from the kitchen. No one observed her careful movements as she locked every exit from the main house except for the kitchen door. No one realized that she had been gradually increasing the temperature of the sugarcane furnace throughout the evening, bringing it to a level of heat that would be dangerous, even for its intended cooking purposes. Her plan was elegant in its simplicity and horrifying in its implications. Over the preceding few days, she had used her access to the manor's storage areas to place oil-soaked twine and chains at strategic locations throughout the house. These instruments of restraint, normally used to punish rebellious slaves, were now distributed so that she could quickly subdue anyone she encountered. She had also prepared a special concoction based on knowledge passed down from her grandmother, combining local herbs that could render a person unconscious within minutes if absorbed through food or drink. This mixture had been carefully added to the decanter of cognac she had been serving throughout the evening. As the members of the Sugarcane Council continued their discussion of human breeding programs, the first effects of Zara's preparations began to manifest. Raoul Street, Claire, who had consumed more cognac than the others, began to feel dizzy and disoriented. He attributed it to the heat and the alcohol, but within minutes he slumped over in his chair, struggling to maintain consciousness. One by one, the other members began to experience similar symptoms. Lawrence Duval complained of a sudden wave of nausea. François Leclerc found himself unable to focus his eyes. Etienne Moreau's hands began to tremble uncontrollably. It was Theodore Blackwood who first realized that something was seriously wrong. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice already slurring, "I believe we may have been. Someone has." But before he could complete the thought, his legs gave out from under him, and he collapsed onto the imported Turkish rug that had cost more than most colonists earned in a year. Within 25 minutes, all 13 members of the Sugarcane Council were unconscious. Zara worked with methodical efficiency, using the twine and chains to restrain each man's hands and feet. The bonds she applied were the same devices that had been used to bind thousands of slaves over the years. Devices designed to inflict pain and prevent escape while keeping the victim alive and functional. She took particular care to ensure that each bond was tight enough to cause significant discomfort, but not so restrictive as to cut off circulation completely. She did not intend for these men to escape through the mercy of a quick death. As she worked, she spoke to each unconscious man in a mixture of African, French, and her broken English, sometimes explaining what she was doing, sometimes recounting specific instances of cruelty she had witnessed, sometimes simply giving voice to the rage that had been building inside her for 18 years. "You sold my Malik as if he were a cow," she whispered to François Leclerc as she locked a chain around his ankle. "You buy and sell people as if they are nothing. Tonight, you learn what it feels like to be nothing." To Etienne Moreau, she said, "You break spirits. You teach people to stop being human. Tonight, I teach you what a broken spirit feels like." To Theodore Blackwood, her voice carried 18 years of suppressed hatred. "You owned me. You thought you could do whatever you wanted with me. You thought I was an animal. Tonight, you see what an animal does when it has no other choice." Once all 13 men were securely restrained, Zara began the most physically demanding part of her plan. One by one, she dragged their unconscious bodies from the dining room, through the house, and into the kitchen. The process took nearly 4 hours, as each man was significantly heavier than her, and she had to move carefully to avoid making any noise that might alert other slaves or overseers who might still be awake. By 3 a.m., all 13 members of the Sugarcane Council were arranged in the shape of a cross around the massive sugarcane furnace, their feet pointing toward the center, their hands restrained behind their backs with chains, their mouths stuffed with raw sugarcane leaves to prevent them from calling for help when they awoke. The furnace itself had been stoked to its maximum temperature and was radiating a heat that made the kitchen almost unbearable, even for someone who was not restrained. Zara had calculated that the combination of extreme heat, dehydration, and restricted movement would create a prolonged form of torture that would give these men time to contemplate their fate while they died a slow, agonizing death. But she had also prepared for a more immediate form of justice. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the kitchen windows, the members of the Sugarcane Council began to regain consciousness. The herbal mixture she had used was designed to induce unconsciousness for several hours, but to leave no permanent damage, ensuring that her victims would be fully aware of their situation when the torture began. Theodore Blackwood was the first to wake, and his confusion quickly turned to terror as he realized his predicament. He was lying on the stone floor of his own kitchen, bound hand and foot with chains, unable to speak because of the sugarcane leaves stuffed in his mouth, and surrounded by the other council members in a similar state. The massive sugarcane furnace at the center of their circle was radiating heat like a miniature version of hell. As the other men regained consciousness, the kitchen filled with the sound of muffled screams and desperate struggles against unbreakable restraints. They were experiencing, for the first time in their lives, the absolute powerlessness they had inflicted on thousands of other human beings. Zara sat calmly in a corner of the kitchen, methodically polishing the silver spoons she had used to prepare their food. She had positioned herself so that each man could see her clearly, and she maintained eye contact with each of them as they fully grasped the hopelessness of their situation. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said in clear, articulate English, far better than she had ever spoken in their presence before. "I hope you rested well. We have much to discuss, and I want to be sure I have everyone's full attention." She stood and walked slowly around the circle, looking down at each bound man with the same cold, appraising expression they used when inspecting slaves at the New Orleans market. "For 18 years I have served your meetings. I have listened to your conversations. I have heard you discuss my people as if we were cattle to be bought and sold and bred and killed at your convenience. She stopped beside Etienne Moreau, who was struggling frantically against his restraints. You, Mr. Moreau, specialize in breaking spirits. You take people who still remember being human and you teach them to forget. You have perfected the art of destroying hope, of turning proud men and women into empty shells who exist only to serve your pleasure. She moved on to Francois Leclerc. You, Mr. Leclerc, use family separation as a tool of control. You deliberately destroy the bonds between parent and child, between husband and wife, because you have learned that a person with no family is easier to control. She continued around the circle, addressing each man by name and recounting specific acts of cruelty she had witnessed or heard described during their monthly meetings. With each recitation, the men's struggles became more desperate and their muffled screams more frantic. Finally, she returned to Theodore Blackwood. And you, Mr. Blackwood, are the worst of them all because you could have chosen to be different. You had education, you had wealth, you had power. You could have treated us as human beings. Instead, you chose to be a monster because it was more profitable to be a monster. She returned to the center of the circle, standing directly in front of the sugarcane furnace. Today, you will experience what it is to be powerless. You will learn what it means to be at the mercy of someone who considers you less than human. And you will die a slow, painful death, with plenty of time to think about all the suffering you have caused. With that pronouncement, Zara began the final phase of her plan. What happened over the next 7 hours would become the stuff of legend and nightmare throughout colonial Louisiana, though the full details would be buried in a sealed government archive for more than a century. Zara and Kosi turned the kitchen of Blackwood Manor into a theater of retribution, where the 13 most powerful men in the state experienced, for the first and last time, what it meant to be utterly powerless in the hands of someone who considered them less than human. She began with psychological torture, moving slowly around the circle and forcing each man to listen as she recounted, in excruciating detail, specific instances of cruelty she had witnessed over her 18 years of servitude. She described children being ripped from their mothers' arms, husbands being separated from their wives, proud men being reduced to broken shells through systematic brutality. She spoke in the same calm, measured tones that these men often used when discussing the management of their human property. "Mr. Duval," she said, kneeling beside the terrified planter, "do you remember the woman named Aisha? She was pregnant when you bought her in 1850. You worked her in the sugarcane fields until the day she went into labor. Then you sold her baby to a trader from Texas before she had even recovered from childbirth. She cried for 3 days straight. You ordered your overseer to whip her because the noise was disturbing your sleep." Duval's eyes widened in horror as he recognized the case. Like most planters, he had committed so many acts of casual cruelty that individual cases blurred together in his memory. But Zara had remembered every detail, every name, every act of systematic degradation she had witnessed. She moved on to Louis Fontaine. "You enjoy watching punishments, Mr. Fontaine. You attend whippings the way other men attend horse races. Last spring, you paid Mr. Blackwood $7 to personally administer 60 lashes to a man who had tried to run away. You took your time, spacing out the lashes so that he would remain conscious for the entire punishment. You were smiling the whole time. The heat from the sugarcane furnace was becoming unbearable. Sweat poured down the bound men's faces, mixing with tears of terror and creating dark stains on their expensive imported clothing. Several of them were already beginning to show signs of heat exhaustion, their breathing rapid, their skin flushed, and a vacant look in their eyes that preceded collapse. But Zara was not finished with the psychological part of her revenge. She retrieved a leather-bound ledger from Theodore Blackwood's study, the same kind of book where he recorded the purchase, sale, and breeding of his human property. Opening it to a random page, she began to read the entries aloud in the flat, unemotional voice that planters used when discussing business transactions. The 15th of April, 1851. Sold boy named Elias, age 13, to Leclerc plantation for breeding purposes. $50 sterling. Note: mother became unmanageable after separation. Recommend immediate sale or disposal. She turned the page. The 2nd of June, 1851. Female named Sophia died in childbirth. Infant survived. Estimated loss of $25 sterling. Note: implement better nutritional program for breeding females to reduce mortality rate. Page after page, she read the clinical documentation of human suffering. Families destroyed, children sold, men and women reduced to monetary calculations in a businessman's ledger. The psychological torture continued for 2 hours, with Zara forcing each man to confront the full scope of their crimes against humanity. She had an extraordinary memory for detail, enhanced by 18 years of paying careful attention to their conversations. She could recall specific dates, individual names, and the particular acts of cruelty that each man had either committed or ordered. But as the morning sun climbed higher and the temperature in the kitchen approached 125 degrees Fahrenheit, she moved to the next phase of her plan. From the kitchen storage area, she retrieved several long iron rods, the same tools used to stoke the sugarcane furnace and manipulate heavy pots. She placed these rods directly into the furnace's fire, where they quickly heated to a cherry-red glow, a temperature that would inflict agonizing burns on contact with human skin. "Gentlemen," she announced, "you have spent years perfecting the art of inflicting pain without causing immediate death. You have learned how to torture people for maximum effect while keeping them alive and functional. Today, I will demonstrate that your student has been paying attention." She withdrew the first iron rod from the furnace. The metal glowed like a captured piece of the sun, radiating a heat that could be felt from several feet away. Moving to Theodore Blackwood, she held the rod close enough to his face for him to feel its intense heat without actually touching him. "This is for every slave you have branded like cattle," she said calmly. "This is for every human being you have marked as your property." What happened next is too brutal to describe in detail, but the screams that echoed through the kitchen of Blackwood Manor could be heard by slaves working in the fields nearly half a mile away. The sounds were unlike anything they had ever heard before. The desperate, agonized cries of men who had never experienced true helplessness and were now discovering what their victims had endured for decades. Zara worked methodically, applying the hot iron to each man in turn, targeting non-lethal areas that would cause maximum pain, while ensuring that her victims remained conscious and aware. She had learned from observing their own torture techniques, understanding exactly how much damage the human body could sustain while still retaining its capacity for suffering. In between applications of the hot iron, she continued her psychological assault, describing in detail how each man's plantation would be inherited by relatives who might or might not continue their cruel practices. She spoke of their children, wondering aloud whether the next generation would prove to be as monstrous as their fathers, or whether they might develop some capacity for human empathy. "Your son, Louis," she said to Etienne Moreau as he writhed in agony. "He is only 17. Perhaps there is still time for him to become a better man than his father. Perhaps when he learns what happened to you, he will decide that treating people like property is too dangerous." The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical torture. These men had built their entire identities around the belief that they were superior beings, natural masters with the right to control and exploit other human beings. Zara was systematically dismantling that identity, forcing them to experience themselves as victims, as objects to be manipulated by someone else's will. As the afternoon heat combined with the furnace's radiation to push the kitchen's temperature above 130 degrees Fahrenheit, several of the men began to show signs of severe heat stroke. Their skin was red and dry, their breathing became rapid and shallow, and their struggles against their bonds became weaker and more desperate. But Zara had planned for this contingency. She did not intend for them to escape through unconsciousness or heat-induced delirium. Using techniques learned from her grandmother, she applied cool, wet cloths to their foreheads and forced small amounts of water into their mouths, keeping them just conscious and aware enough while their bodies slowly cooked in the superheated air. "You must stay awake," she told them. "You must be alert. Death is a mercy, and you have not yet earned mercy." The torture continued through the hottest part of the afternoon, with Zara maintaining the furnace at its maximum temperature while systematically applying the hot iron rods to each man's body. She targeted their hands, their feet, and their faces, areas that would cause excruciating pain while remaining visible as a permanent reminder of their experience. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of the entire ordeal was not the physical suffering, but the complete reversal of the power dynamic it represented. For the first time in their lives, These 13 men were experiencing what their slaves endured on a daily basis. The knowledge that another human being had complete control over their bodies, their comfort, their very survival. They were learning what it meant to be property. As evening approached and shadows began to fall across the kitchen floor, Zara prepared for the final act of her carefully orchestrated revenge. The sugarcane furnace had been burning at its maximum temperature for nearly 20 hours, creating a level of heat that was literally unbearable for prolonged human exposure. She began dragging the semi-conscious men closer to the furnace, positioning them so that its intense heat would slowly cook their bodies while keeping them alive, just long enough to fully appreciate their fate. It was a technique she had heard Etienne Moreau describe during a sugarcane council meeting, a method he used to punish slaves who had tried to escape. "This is how you killed Samuel," she told Moreau, as she positioned his body within 3 feet of the glowing embers. "Remember Samuel, the young man who tried to run away last summer? You put him in a metal cage in the direct sun and let him slowly cook for 3 days. He begged for water, he begged for shade, he begged for death. You ignored all his pleas because you wanted the other slaves to witness his suffering." One by one, she arranged all 13 men in positions where the furnace's radiant heat would slowly kill them, while leaving them just conscious enough to contemplate their crimes. The psychological impact was as important to her as the physical destruction. She wanted them to understand with perfect clarity that they were dying because of the choices they had made, the actions they had taken, and the lives they had destroyed. As the sun set on the 29th of June 1852, the kitchen of Blackwood Manor contained 13 dying men who were experiencing, for the first and last time, what it felt like to be completely helpless in the hands of someone who considered them less than human. The screaming had stopped several hours earlier, replaced by the weaker sounds of men whose vocal cords had been ruined by prolonged crying. The kitchen was filled with the smell of burning flesh and the sound of labored breathing as the 13 most powerful citizens of colonial Louisiana slowly roasted to death beside the sugarcane furnace they had used to prepare the meals served by the people they had enslaved. Zara sat in the corner, still methodically polishing the silver spoons, humming the African folk song her mother had sung to her in the village that French pirates had destroyed 20 years earlier. She no longer looked at the dying men, but her ears remained alert to the sound of their breathing, ensuring that none of them escaped into unconsciousness before experiencing the full measure of the justice she had planned. As midnight approached, the last member of the Sugarcane Council finally succumbed to the combination of heat, dehydration, and burns that had been slowly killing them all day. Theodore Blackwood was the last to survive, his physique fortified by years of rich living and medical care that was never available to his slaves. His last coherent words, whispered barely audibly over the sound of the burning sugarcane, were a pathetic attempt at negotiation. "Please, I can give you money, freedom, anything you want." Zara looked at him with the same mild interest he had used when inspecting slaves at the New Orleans market. "I want you to die knowing that you were wrong," she replied calmly. "You are not superior. You are not divinely chosen. You are not a natural master. You are just a man who chose to be evil, and now you are paying the price for that choice." Those were the last words Theodore Blackwood heard before the heat and dehydration finally claimed his life. Dawn broke on the 30th of June 1852, revealing a scene that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. As the other plantation slaves began their morning routines, they discovered 13 charred bodies, arranged in a perfect cross around the massive sugarcane furnace in the Blackwood Manor kitchen. The bodies were barely recognizable as human, reduced to blackened husks by 20 hours of exposure to extreme heat. Zara Nkosi was found sitting calmly at the kitchen table, methodically polishing silver spoons while humming a haunting melody that none of the other slaves recognized. She showed no signs of distress or exhaustion, despite having orchestrated and witnessed one of the most calculated acts of vengeance in American colonial history. When the plantation's white overseers arrived to investigate, they found a scene that defied their understanding of the natural order. The 13 most powerful men in the state had been killed by a lone female slave who had outsmarted and overpowered them all and subjected them to a form of torture that was beyond their experience. The implications were terrifying. If one slave could achieve this level of devastation against so many planters, what might happen if slaves began to organize more sophisticated forms of resistance? The psychological impact on the white colonial population was immediate and profound. For the first time, they began to fear the people they had enslaved. News of the massacre spread throughout the state within days, carried by riders who were dispatched to inform the victims' families and business partners. But the colonial authorities faced a serious problem in deciding how to respond to the incident. On the one hand, they needed to demonstrate that slave revolts would be met with swift and brutal retaliation. The entire plantation system depended on maintaining the belief among slaves that resistance was futile and that white dominance was absolute and permanent. On the other hand, they needed to prevent the spread of detailed information about Zara's methods and success. If other slaves learned that 13 planters could be killed by a single woman armed with nothing more than her intelligence, patience, and determination, the results could be catastrophic for the entire colonial economy. Governor Paul O. Hebert convened an emergency session of the Colonial Council to discuss the crisis. After 4 days of intense debate, they reached a decision that prioritized political stability over public justice. The official records of the Blackwood Massacre were sealed by order of the governor and locked away in the New Orleans archives, with instructions that they not be opened for 60 years. The victims' families were informed that their relatives had died in a tragic fire that had consumed the Blackwood Manor kitchen during a business meeting. No mention was made of Zara's role in their deaths. Zara herself presented a more complex problem. Executing her publicly would require an explanation of her crimes, which would spread the very information the colonial authorities wanted to suppress. But allowing her to live would send the message that slave revolts could succeed without consequence. The solution they devised was as cruel as it was politically astute. Zara was sentenced to be sold to a Cuban trader who specialized in supplying slaves for the South American copper mines, a fate that was universally understood to be a delayed death sentence. Working conditions in the Cuban mines were so brutal that slaves rarely survived for more than 2 years before succumbing to exhaustion, disease, or accidents. But even this sentence carried a risk. If Zara survived long enough to share her story with other slaves, she could become a symbol of successful resistance that could inspire further revolts. The colonial authorities solved this problem by ensuring that Zara would never reach the Cuban mines alive. On the 18th of July, 1852, exactly 3 weeks after the Blackwood Massacre, Zara Nkosi was put aboard a Cuban merchant ship named El Salvador, bound for Havana. The captain had been given secret instructions to ensure that she did not survive the voyage, but to make her death look like an accident. The El Salvador left New Orleans harbor on the evening tide, carrying 52 other slaves along with Zara. According to the official ship's log, she died of a fever on the 5th day of the voyage and was buried at sea, according to standard maritime practice. But there were rumors. Some of the surviving slaves from Blackwood Manor claimed that Zara had spoken of a contingency plan involving allies in Cuba who would help her escape if she survived the sea voyage. Others whispered that she had been seen speaking with free black sailors in the New Orleans harbor, perhaps arranging for assistance during the voyage. Most importantly, several slaves reported that Zara had spent her final weeks at the manor teaching other houseworkers about herbs, anatomy, the weaknesses of their masters, and the vulnerabilities of the plantation system. "Justice burns slower than sugar cane," she told them, "but it burns clean. The fire I started will spread to other kitchens, other plantations, other masters who think they are safe." Whether these rumors contained any truth is impossible to determine. The colonial authorities moved quickly to disperse the surviving slaves from Blackwood Manor, selling them to plantations across the region to prevent any coordination of stories or activities. But the psychological damage was done. In the months following the Blackwood Massacre, a wave of unrest swept through the slave communities of Louisiana. There were no more mass killings like Zara's methodical execution of the sugarcane council members, but planters began to report an unprecedented series of small incidents that suggested coordinated resistance. Kitchen fires destroyed several plantation houses under suspicious circumstances. Valuable livestock died mysteriously after eating food that may have been poisoned. White overseers suffered strange accidents at precisely the moments when they were most vulnerable. Tools and weapons disappeared from storage sheds, only to be found days later in locations that suggested slave involvement. Most disturbing to the colonial authorities, slaves began to demonstrate a knowledge of their masters' personal habits, business arrangements, and family relationships that went far beyond what their duties should have provided. It was as if an intelligence network had developed across the plantation system, with information flowing freely between properties that had previously been isolated from one another. The psychological impact on the white colonial population was profound and lasting. Planters who had once moved through their properties with casual confidence now traveled with armed escorts and avoided predictable routines. The monthly meetings that had been the cornerstone of the Sugarcane Council's coordination were suspended indefinitely, because no one wanted to gather in a large group that might present an attractive target for a coordinated reprisal. Some planters began to modify their treatment of slaves, not out of any moral awakening, but out of practical fear. If slaves were capable of the kind of sophisticated planning and execution that had destroyed the Sugarcane Council, then maintaining their loyalty through slightly better conditions was perhaps a wise investment in personal security. But other planters moved in the opposite direction, implementing even harsher controls and punishments in an attempt to terrorize their slaves into submission. These plantations experienced higher rates of escape attempts, work slowdowns, and mysterious accidents that suggested the strategy was backfiring. The colonial authorities responded with new laws that restricted slave movement, prohibited gatherings of more than 3 slaves without white supervision, and mandated harsh punishments for any slave caught with a weapon or a tool that could be used as a weapon. But these laws were difficult to enforce across a distributed plantation system, and they may have actually encouraged more sophisticated forms of resistance by driving slave organization further underground. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Zara Nkosi began to spread through the networks of free black communities, the Underground Railroad, and the sympathetic white abolitionists who were beginning to organize against slavery. Her name became a symbol of resistance that inspired other acts of rebellion across colonial America. Historians would later debate whether the Blackwood Massacre represented an isolated case of personal revenge or the beginning of a more systematic form of slave resistance that contributed to the eventual collapse of the plantation system. The sealed colonial records made a definitive analysis impossible, but circumstantial evidence suggested that Zara's actions had inspired copycat incidents throughout the South. In 1854, just 2 years after the Blackwood Massacre, Bleeding, Kansas erupted, one of the largest slave conflicts in American colonial history. While a specific connection to Zara's actions cannot be proven, several of the conflict's leaders were slaves who had worked on plantations connected to the original Sugarcane Council network. The conflict was eventually suppressed, but it demonstrated that the psychological impact of the Blackwood Massacre had not faded with time. Slaves throughout the region had learned that their masters were not invincible, that careful planning could overcome superior numbers and weaponry, and that acts of resistance could succeed even against seemingly impossible odds. As the years passed and the Industrial Revolution changed the colonial political landscape, the story of Zara Nkosi became part of an oral tradition that sustained slave communities through their darkest hours. Parents told their children about the woman who had made 13 masters pay for their cruelty. Young slaves learned that resistance was possible, that intelligence and patience were more powerful than physical strength, and that justice could be delayed but would eventually arrive. The sealed records in the New Orleans archives remained unopened for exactly 60 years, as Governor Hebert had ordered. When they were finally opened to researchers in 1912, America was in the midst of the turmoil that would lead to the abolition of slavery. The story of the Blackwood Massacre was overshadowed by larger historical events, but it contributed to a growing awareness that the institution of slavery contained the seeds of its own destruction. By the time the U.S. Constitution was amended in 1865, the plantation system that had seemed so permanent and invincible in 1852 was already showing the signs of internal stress that would eventually tear the nation apart. The psychological impact of knowing that slaves could organize, plan, and execute sophisticated acts of resistance had fundamentally changed the master-slave relationship. Masters were no longer confident of their absolute power. Slaves were no longer convinced of their absolute powerlessness. And in that fundamental shift in the psychological balance lay the beginning of the end for American slavery. In the years following the Blackwood Massacre, whispers of the truth began to emerge from the most unexpected sources. A Cuban ship's clerk writing in his personal journal during a voyage to Havana in late 1852, recorded an extraordinary conversation with an African-speaking woman who had been secretly transferred from the El Salvador during a supply stop in Nassau. According to the clerk's account, this woman spoke with remarkable intelligence about the Louisiana plantation system, describing in precise detail the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of individual planters throughout the colony. She claimed to have orchestrated what she called the first lesson, but suggested that it would not be the last. The fire started in one kitchen. She was quoted as telling the clerk, "Will spread to many kitchens. The lessons I learned from watching my masters at their evil work are now being taught to new students." Whether this woman was indeed Zara Nkosi was never confirmed, but colonial records from Cuba began to note the arrival of unusually well-informed escaped slaves who possessed detailed knowledge of plantation operations across French territory. These refugees seemed to have access to an intelligence network that extended far beyond what any individual escapee should have known. More disturbing to the colonial authorities, reports began to filter out of the Cuban territories describing communities of former slaves who were actively supporting escape attempts and resistance activities in the French colonies. Intercepted letters by colonial officials contained detailed instructions for identifying sympathetic contacts, avoiding patrol routes, and exploiting the psychological vulnerabilities of planters who had grown careless in their confidence. By 1855, just 3 years after the Blackwood Massacre, the colonial authorities were forced to acknowledge that slave resistance had evolved beyond individual escape attempts into something closer to organized warfare. Planters throughout Louisiana began to report coordinated incidents that suggested systematic planning and intelligence gathering. Kitchen fires destroyed several plantation houses under circumstances that defied natural explanation. Valuable livestock died mysteriously after eating food that seemed to have been deliberately poisoned. White overseers suffered fatal accidents at moments when they were isolated and most vulnerable. Most unsettling of all, slaves began to demonstrate a knowledge of their masters' personal habits, business dealings, and family secrets that went far beyond what their assigned duties should have revealed. It was as if an invisible network had developed across the plantation system, with information flowing freely between properties that had previously been isolated from one another. The psychological transformation was profound and lasting. Planters who had once moved through their properties with casual arrogance now traveled with armed escorts and avoided predictable routines. The monthly gatherings that had been the center of the Sugar Cane Council's coordination were suspended permanently. Because no one wanted to present an attractive target for a coordinated reprisal, some planters began to modify their treatment of slaves, not out of any moral awakening, but out of practical terror. If their human property was capable of the kind of sophisticated planning and execution that had destroyed the Sugar Cane Council, then maintaining their loyalty through slightly better conditions was perhaps a wise investment in personal survival. But other planters reacted with increased violence, implementing harsher punishments and more restrictive controls in a desperate attempt to terrorize their slaves into absolute submission. These plantations experienced higher rates of mysterious accidents, work slowdowns, and escape attempts that suggested the strategy was having the opposite effect. The colonial authorities passed new laws restricting slave movement, prohibiting gatherings, and mandating severe punishments for any slave found with a potential weapon. But these regulations were difficult to enforce across a distributed plantation system, and they may have actually encouraged more sophisticated forms of underground organization. As the decades passed, the story of Zara Nkosi was woven into the fabric of slave resistance across colonial America. Parents whispered to their children about the woman who had made 13 masters pay for their cruelty. Young slaves learned that their masters were not invincible, that careful planning could overcome superior numbers and weaponry, and that justice could be delayed but would eventually arrive. The sealed records in the New Orleans archives remained locked as Governor Hebert had ordered, but the truth had already escaped through other channels. Every slave community knew the essential facts. One woman, armed with only her intelligence and determination, had killed the 13 most powerful men in the state and lived to escape their justice. Whether Zara had actually survived to continue her work in Cuba, or whether the reports of her subsequent activities were myths created to instill hope in a desperate people, became less important than the psychological impact of her story. Masters were no longer confident of their absolute power. Slaves were no longer convinced of their absolute powerlessness. And in that fundamental shift in the psychological balance lay the seeds of everything that was to follow. The growing resistance movements, the Underground Railroad network, the persistent rebellions that would eventually contribute to the destruction of the entire plantation system. The kitchen at Blackwood Manor stood empty for 72 years after that night of reckoning, gradually falling into ruin as subsequent owners found the building impossible to staff. Local slaves refused to work in the room where Zara had demonstrated what happens to masters who push their human property beyond human endurance. Eventually, the entire structure was demolished and the land was allowed to return to wilderness. But the lesson remained, passed down through generations of slave families who understood that those who choose to treat other human beings as property do so at their own peril. Property can think, property can plan, property can remember everything, and sometimes, when pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, property fights back. Justice burns slower than sugarcane, but it burns clean. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything has been revealed, or are there still secrets buried in the dark archives of our nation's history? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts on this remarkable story of resistance and revenge. If you enjoyed this journey into America's hidden past and want more stories that reveal the truth behind the official histories, subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who appreciates the power of an untold story. History is written by the victors, but sometimes the voices of the victims find a way to be heard across the centuries. See you in the next video, where we continue to explore the dark secrets that have shaped our nation.